My name is Claire Morrow. I am 34 years old, and on a Tuesday evening in the third week of November, at 9:47 at night, I was sitting at my desk on the fourth floor of a federal building on Bull Street in Savannah, Georgia, reviewing wire transfer records for a financial fraud case I had spent 14 months building, when my government-issued phone buzzed once, quietly, against the surface of my desk. It was a geolocation alert. Automatic. Routine. The kind my phone sent every time one of the 3 GPS tracking devices embedded in my agency-issued vehicle registered unexpected movement. The black 2022 Ford Explorer assigned to me by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had just traveled 4.3 miles from my parents' address on Habersham Street to a private residence on Skidaway Road. The journey had taken 11 minutes. The vehicle had stopped. It was not moving. I remember setting the phone face down on the desk. I remember folding my hands in my lap. I remember the hum of the fluorescent light overhead and the sound of someone running water in the break room down the hall. And I remember making a decision, in that quiet, in that stillness, that I would not call my brother. I would not call my mother. I would not drive to Skidaway Road. I would not raise my voice. I would not do a single thing that anyone who loved a person in my position would have told me to do. I would just wait. What my brother Dominic did not know, what not one single member of my family knew, was that the Ford Explorer parked on Skidaway Road was not my car. It was a federally assigned government vehicle registered to the Internal Revenue Service. It carried 3 independent GPS tracking devices and a complete digital audit log that time-stamped every door opening, every ignition event, every fuel transaction, and every person whose fingerprints contacted its surfaces. And the moment my brother sold it to a private buyer for $5,200 in cash to settle a debt with an underground gambling operation on the south side of Savannah, he had committed a federal felony. This is that story. I grew up the younger of 2 children in a house on Habersham Street in the Ardsley Park neighborhood of Savannah, the kind of street with oak trees, old enough to have names and front porches wide enough to hold a whole family's silence. My father, Raymond Morrow, is 67 years old. He spent 31 years as a senior loan officer at a regional bank before he retired, and he carried himself through that career and through our household with the particular authority of a man who was used to being the person other people asked for permission. My mother, Sylvia Morrow, is 64, a retired elementary school librarian who organized every space she inhabited with the same quiet diligence she brought to the Dewey Decimal System, and who managed our home with a warm efficiency that I loved deeply even when I did not always understand it. They were not cruel people, they were not dishonest people, but they had made one consistent and consequential error across my entire childhood and adult life, and that error had a name, and the name was Dominic. Dominic Raymond Morrow is 39 years old. He is the firstborn, the only son, the child whose name my mother says with a slightly different inflection than she uses for mine, a softness that I noticed by the time I was 8 years old, and that I had simply catalogued and filed away somewhere quiet inside myself, where I kept the other things I had decided not to make into a conflict. Dominic was charming in the way that people are charming when they have always been told they are charming. He was funny, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who walked into a room and made a noise about it. He had worked, over the years, in car sales, in property management, in insurance, in a landscaping business he started with a loan he never paid back, and in a consulting arrangement for a cousin's restaurant that lasted 4 months before collapsing under circumstances he was always very busy explaining. None of it ever quite worked. None of it was ever quite his fault. The gambling started, as far as I could trace it, somewhere in Dominic's late 20s. It started, the way these things tend to start, with something social. Sports bets between friends. A fantasy football league with a $100 entry. A few hands of poker at someone's house in Isle of Hope. And then, slowly, quietly, the way a river changes a landscape without anyone watching the individual minutes of it, it became something else entirely. By the time Dominic was 33, it had become a framework for his entire financial existence. He did not have savings because the savings became bets. He did not have a retirement fund because the retirement fund became bets. He moved back into our parents' house on Habersham Street in the spring of 2 years before this story takes place, and he told Raymond and Sylvia it was temporary, a transition period between opportunities. He had been there ever since. I want to give you 3 specific examples because I think the pattern matters more than any single incident, and because I want you to understand that what my brother did to me was not an aberration. It was the predictable continuation of something that had been building for a very long time. Christmas of the year before last, Dominic told my parents he needed $8,000 for an investment opportunity in a logistics startup that a friend of a friend was launching in Jacksonville. Raymond transferred the money within 48 hours. By February of the following year, when my mother mentioned the investment at Sunday dinner and asked how it was developing, Dominic said the startup had pivoted away from the original model and the capital had been absorbed into the restructuring. He said it with the kind of fluid ease that belongs to people who have had a lot of practice explaining why money is gone. There was no startup. I knew this because I know how to research financial entities, and because I had done so on a quiet Saturday afternoon in March, when something in the way he described it had felt structurally wrong to me. The $8,000 had covered, I was nearly certain, a losing streak at a private card game that operated out of a commercial property on Abercorn Street that I had no official business knowing about. In the spring of the year before this story, Dominic convinced my parents to co-sign a vehicle loan for a 2019 Chevrolet Silverado that he said he needed for a new contracting venture. The loan was $412 a month. By October of that year, he had missed 7 consecutive payments. Raymond and Sylvia covered them. All 7. And then 2 more. They did not tell me. I found out because my father mentioned it once, sideways, in the middle of a conversation about something else, in the tone of a man reporting a minor inconvenience that had already been resolved and did not require any further discussion. And then, in March of this year, 8 months before the night of the GPS alert, Dominic came to my apartment on East Jones Street at 11:20 in the morning on a Wednesday. I was home because I was working a surveillance shift from my personal laptop and did not need to be in the office until the afternoon. He sat down at my kitchen table without being invited to sit, and he told me he needed $30,200. He said he would have it back to me within 3 weeks. He did not say what it was for. I did not ask. I had learned over many years that asking Dominic what money was for produced long, elaborate, internally consistent answers that were almost never accurate, so I simply said no. The word landed in the kitchen the way a stone lands in still water. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had seen on his face before, a particular recalibration, the look of a man deciding how to reframe something he did not like. And then he said, "You know what, Claire? I don't know why I bother. You've always thought you were better than us." He left without saying goodbye. 2 days later, my mother called me to ask why I had upset Dominic. She said, "He came home looking like you'd slapped him. He says you refused to even hear him out." I did not correct her. I just said I hoped Dominic found what he was looking for, and I let the conversation end. I need to tell you what my family knew about what I did for work, because it is the thing around which everything else in this story turns. They knew I worked for the federal government. They knew it involved finance in some capacity. My father had told people at his golf club that I was a government accountant, and I had never found a reason to correct this description. The full truth is that I am a special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, which is the criminal enforcement arm of the IRS. We investigate financial crimes, tax fraud, money laundering, organized crime finances, asset forfeiture cases. It is not glamorous work. It is detailed, methodical, and almost entirely invisible. I had been doing it for 9 years. I carried a badge and a firearm, and I had, at various points in my career, built cases that resulted in indictments against people who had moved tens of millions of dollars through structures they believed were invisible. I did not talk about it. I did not mention it at family dinners. I had learned early that the work required discretion, and that discretion in my case had become something of a habit. I drove a government-issued vehicle. This was standard for field agents in my division. The vehicle assigned to me was a black 2022 Ford Explorer. Black interior, tinted windows, no visible insignia. To anyone looking at it in a driveway, it would appear to be a private vehicle. It was not. It was federal property, registered to the Internal Revenue Service, equipped with GPS tracking, a remote diagnostic system, and a log that recorded every interaction with the vehicle from ignition to door contact. I had parked it at my parents' house on Habersham Street on the Monday before the Tuesday night of the GPS alert because my personal car, a gray 2019 Honda Civic, had a brake issue. I was having it dressed at a shop on Victory Drive, and my mother had asked me to come for dinner that Sunday and stay over, something I did 2 or 3 times a year. I had taken a rideshare to work Monday morning and planned to collect the Explorer Tuesday evening when I had finished at the office. I had left the spare key on the hook inside the back door. I would spend several weeks after this night trying to determine exactly how long Dominic had known the key was there, whether he had taken it on Monday or on Tuesday, whether he had planned it or acted on an impulse. I would never get a fully satisfying answer to those questions. What I know is this. At 9:47 on Tuesday evening, my brother took that key, started that vehicle, and drove it to Skidaway Road, where he sold it to a man named Terry Okafor for $5,200 in cash. Dominic owed, I would later learn, approximately $6,000 to the operator of an underground gambling establishment on the south side of Savannah. $5,200 was not the full amount, but it was apparently enough. I did not call anyone that night. I took a rideshare home to East Jones Street. I made chamomile tea. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet and I looked at my hands for a long time. And then I opened my personal laptop, not my work computer, and I typed a single line in a document I had been keeping for several years. A private log I had started in a moment of clarity after the incident with the $3,200. I typed the date. I typed the time. I typed, government vehicle moved without authorization, GPS alert confirmed, destination, Skidaway Road, Savannah. And then I closed the laptop and I went to bed. I did not cry. I did not call my mother. I did not drive to Skidaway Road. I just went to bed. At 7:12 the following morning, I called my supervisor. Her name is Patricia Holden. She is 58 years old, and she's been a special agent in charge in the Savannah field office for 11 years. And she has the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in proximity to the worst things that human beings do with other people's money. I called her personal line, not the office number. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything in approximately 4 minutes. I told her about the vehicle. I told her about the GPS alert. I told her about Dominic. I told her about the key on the hook. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, "Claire, you understand what happens next?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to file a formal report this morning. Unauthorized use and possible transfer of a federal asset. We open a case." I said, "I understand." She said, "And you need to recuse yourself from any investigation that touches your brother or his associates." I said, "Already assumed." She said, "I'm sorry this happened to you." I said, "Let's just get it right." That was the moment I stopped being Dominic Morrow's sister who let things slide and started becoming the agent who would see this through to the end. I filed the formal incident report at 8:51 that morning. The case was assigned to 2 of my colleagues, Special Agents Derek Amos and Felicia Grant, within 90 minutes. The GPS log was pulled immediately. It showed the vehicle's complete movement from the time it left Habersham Street at 7:34 on Tuesday evening. I had been in the office by then, which the log confirmed, through its 11-minute journey to Skidaway Road, where it had remained stationary until 6:17 on Wednesday morning when it moved again, briefly, to a different address 4 streets away. Derek and Felicia located Terry Okafor by noon on Wednesday. He was a private individual, not a dealer, who had purchased what he believed to be a private vehicle. He was cooperative within about 12 minutes of their arrival, which Derek later told me was not surprising given that 2 federal agents at your door with documentation of a government vehicle in your possession tends to focus the mind considerably. The vehicle was recovered intact. Every item in it was accounted for. The digital logs were preserved, and Dominic's fingerprints, his full prints, ridge and all, were on the ignition panel, the steering wheel, the interior door handle, the spare key he had taken, and the key return slot on the outside door of a convenience store on Montgomery Street, where I later determined he had stopped for gas on the way to Skidaway Road at 7:43 in the evening. In the meantime, I went to work. My own case. My own files. My own 14 months of wire transfer records that needed to be reviewed before a hearing at the end of January. I did not contact Dominic. I did not contact my parents. I did not tell anyone in my family that a federal investigation had been opened. On the Thursday morning after the GPS alert, my mother called me to ask if I was coming for Sunday dinner. I said I had work obligations, but I hoped to make the following week. She said Dominic had mentioned I had seemed distant lately. I said I was fine. We talked about the weather for a few minutes, and then we said goodbye. He did not know. None of them knew. 3 days after the vehicle was recovered, Derek sent me a brief message on our internal system. Unrelated to my vehicle report, he wrote, "But I thought you should be aware that the gambling operation your brother is associated with is currently a named subject in a separate investigation involving financial structuring and unlicensed gambling proceeds." He added, "You are fully recused, just flagging for situational awareness." I read the message twice. I filed it in a folder I had created on my personal desktop simply labeled Patience. Here is what was happening in the weeks that followed, and I want to be specific, because the specificity is what makes this real. November moved into December. Dominic remained at my parents' house on Habersham Street. He continued his routines. He watched football on Sunday afternoons with Raymond, who liked having him there in a way that I recognized as loneliness with a familiar face attached to it. He helped Sylvia bring in groceries on Tuesday mornings. He told people he was working on a new business venture in property management and that things were taking shape. I know this because my mother told me, and because I know Dominic, and because nothing was taking shape. The gambling operation on the south side of Savannah was, according to information I was not officially receiving but was able to piece together through context, continuing to operate. Dominic was, to my knowledge, still involved with it as a regular participant. He called me once, on a Thursday evening in the first week of December at 9 o'clock. I let it ring. He called again 20 minutes later. I let that ring too. He sent a text message that said, "Claire, we need to talk. It's about the car. Call me back." I did not respond. He sent a second message 40 minutes later that said, "I know you're upset. It was a mistake and I'll make it right. Call me." I did not respond. He sent a third message the following morning that said, "You're being dramatic. I told Mom I'd work it out with you. Just call me back." I saved all 3 messages in a folder with the date and time notated. 2 days later, my mother called. She said, "Dominic told me there was some kind of mix-up with the car. He said he borrowed it, and he's going to sort it out with you. Can't you just let him explain?" I said, "Mom, the car wasn't mine to lend." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means exactly what it sounds like. It wasn't mine. It belonged to my employer." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're always so rigid, Claire. Can't you just be family for once?" I said, "I love you, Mom. I'll call you this weekend." And I let the conversation end. The case against Dominic for theft of a federally assigned government vehicle moved forward without any participation from me. Derek and Felicia were meticulous. The documentary record was clean. The vehicle recovery was documented. Terry Okafor's cooperation was on the record. The fingerprint analysis came back in the 3rd week of November. The United States Attorney's Office reviewed the file in the 1st week of December and issued an arrest warrant on a Thursday, 11 days before Christmas. I knew the warrant had been issued because Derek told me, professionally and briefly, that the matter was proceeding. He told me the planned execution date. He asked if I had any reason to believe the subject would be out of the state on that date. I said, no, he would be at our parents' house on Haversham Street. He said, thank you. I said, do what you need to do. He said, we will. If you're still watching, I want to ask you to take a moment and drop a comment below telling me something. Have you ever been the one in your family who was expected to absorb every consequence of someone else's choices, quietly, without complaint? Because that was just what you did? Because that was the role you had been assigned? Have you ever looked at someone who hurt you and said nothing? Not because you had nothing to say, but because the saying felt less powerful than the waiting? If that's you, comment the word patience below. I read every single comment on this channel, and I want to know how many of us there are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because the part of this story that happens next is the part that people do not forget. Christmas Day arrived with the particular weight that December 25th carries in Southern families, which is to say, it carried the weight of every other Christmas that had ever happened before it. My mother had been cooking since the previous afternoon. My father had set up the folding tables in the living room, the way he always did. There were 17 people in that house on Haversham Street by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Raymond and Sylvia, Dominic, myself, 2 of my mother's sisters and their husbands, 4 cousins, ranging in age from 11 to 26, my father's brother Franklin and his wife Gloria, and 2 of Franklin's adult children, Marcus and Serena, who I had always liked for the particular reason that they had nothing to do with any of this. I arrived at 12:45. I was wearing a green dress I had bought specifically for this occasion, not because I wanted to look nice, which I did, but because I wanted to look like myself. Calm, composed, the version of me that takes up space in a room without needing anyone's permission to do so. I brought a sweet potato pie that I had made from scratch on the 24th, using my grandmother's recipe from a handwritten card she had left me years ago. I set it on the kitchen counter, and I hugged my mother and I shook my father's hand the way he preferred. And then I went into the living room, and I sat down on the sofa near the fireplace, and I accepted a glass of sparkling water from Serena, who asked how work was going and who I told was going very well, thank you. Dominic was in the living room when I arrived. He was sitting in the armchair near the window with a plate of cheese and crackers on his knee and a football game on the television behind him. And when I came through the door, he looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has been told by someone that a thing will be fine and who has chosen to believe them. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." And then I went to sit on the sofa and I looked at the fireplace. He laughed once at something Marcus said about the football game, and across the room I counted. I counted 3 seconds, then 5. Then I looked out the window at the oak tree in the front yard, the one my grandfather had called the senator because it was old enough to have opinions, and I watched its branches move in the December wind. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. My mother was in the kitchen. My father moved to answer it. I did not move. I sat with my sparkling water, and I kept my eyes on the fireplace, and I heard my father open the front door, and I heard him say, in a voice that had a new quality I had never heard in it before, a quality that was adjacent to fear, "Can I help you?" And then I heard a woman's voice, clear, professional, neutral, say, "Sir, we're federal agents. We have a warrant for the arrest of Dominic Raymond Morrow. Is he on the premises?" The living room went still, the way rooms go. Still when something has happened that cannot be undone. Not slowly, not incrementally, all at once. The way a chord stops. Dominic was on his feet before I looked at him. I know this because when I turned my head he was already standing, and his plate was on the floor, and the cheese and crackers were scattered across my mother's rug, and his face had traveled through approximately 4 expressions in the time it took for all of that to happen, and none of them were the smirk I had watched him wear at my kitchen table in March when I had said no to him and he had left. This was something entirely different. This was a man watching the architecture of a belief collapse in real time. Derek Amos and Felicia Grant came through the front door of the house on Habersham Street in Savannah, Georgia on Christmas Day at 2:17 in the afternoon with 2 additional agents behind them and a warrant with Dominic's name on it, And they moved through that living room with the calm, considered efficiency of people who had done this before, and who understood that the dignity of the moment depended on their composure more than anyone else's. They identified themselves. They stated the warrant. They told Dominic he was under arrest for theft of a federally assigned government vehicle. Dominic said, "This is insane." He said, "It was a misunderstanding." He said, "Claire, tell them." He was looking at me across the room when he said that last part. He was looking at me with something in his eyes that I can only describe as the realization that he had been looking at me for his entire adult life and had fundamentally misidentified what he was looking at. I looked back at him. I did not speak. I did not stand. I held my glass of sparkling water in both hands, and I looked at my brother across the room with the stillness that 9 years of building cases against people who thought they were invisible had given me. And I think in that moment he understood something for the first time. I think he understood that the thing he had always read as passivity in me, the thing he had always read as acceptance, had never been passivity at all. My mother made a sound from the kitchen doorway. She had come in during the warrant statement, and she was standing in the frame with a dish towel in both hands and a look on her face that I recognized because I had seen it before on the faces of people who discover that something they believed was safe was not. My father stood very still near the front door. He did not speak. Franklin and Gloria were on the couch. Marcus had his hand on Serena's arm. The cousins had gone quiet. The football game was still on the television. Nobody turned it off. Dominic was walked out of the front door of the house on Habersham Street in Savannah, Georgia, in handcuffs at 2:23 in the afternoon on Christmas Day. I know the time because I was watching the clock on the mantelpiece. The 2 federal vehicles were parked at the curb beneath the Senator Oak tree, and Dominic was placed in the back of the first one. And then the vehicles pulled away from the curb and turned left at the end of the street, and that was that. The living room was silent for a moment that felt longer than it was. And then my mother sat down on the nearest chair and pressed the dish towel over her face. And my father turned from the window and looked at me. And I saw him looking at me the way people look at something they are seeing for the first time, even though it has been in front of them for years. "Claire," he said, just the one word, and in it was a whole taxonomy of things he had not known, he did not know. I set my glass of sparkling water on the coffee table. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my dress. I said quietly to the room, to no one in particular, "The turkey is going to need another 40 minutes. And then I walked into the kitchen and I checked the oven. The weeks that followed were not simple. The clean narratives, the ones where a single event resolves years of accumulated complexity, are mostly stories people tell themselves to make the complexity manageable. What actually happened was slower and messier and more human than that, which is to say, it was truer. Dominic called my personal phone from a number I did not recognize on the 3rd day of January, a Thursday morning at 8:44. I answered because I did not know the number. He said, "You set me up." His voice had the quality of a man who had spent 2 weeks constructing a version of events that allowed him to be the injured party. I said, "Dominic, I reported a federal vehicle stolen. The law handled the rest." He said, "You could have just called me. You could have asked me to give it back." I said, "I did call you. You let it ring, and then you texted me that I was being dramatic." He was quiet. I said, "I'm going to hang up now. Please speak to your attorney." He said, "I didn't know it was a government car." I said, "That's not actually a defense, and your attorney will tell you the same thing." And then I ended the call. My father called me on a Sunday morning in the 2nd week of January. He asked if I could come to the house on Habersham Street. I said I could come the following Saturday. I arrived at 10 in the morning and my mother made coffee and the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table. My father looked older than I had seen him look before. Not physically, but in some less visible way. The way a person's face changes when a belief they have held for a very long time has been revised. He said, "I didn't know what you really did." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have paid closer attention." I said, "Dad, I didn't tell you. I kept it separate. I thought it was simpler that way." He said, "Was it?" I said, "No, probably not." My mother held her coffee cup in both hands and did not say very much. At one point she said, "I keep thinking about what I said to you, about being rigid, about being family." I said, "Mom, I'm not angry at you." She said, "You should be." I said, "I'm really not. You were trying to protect him. That's what you've always done. I understand it." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "But we weren't protecting you." I said, "No, you weren't." And then we sat with that for a while, and the coffee got cold. And outside the Senator Oak Tree moved in the January wind, and nobody said anything for a few minutes. And that was actually all right. Dominic pleaded guilty to theft of a federally assigned government vehicle in the last week of February. He received 36 months of supervised probation and a fine of $12,000 and a federal record that would follow him considerably further than any of the consequences he had previously managed to charm his way around. The gambling operation on the south side of Savannah was shut down in the first week of February, following a separate indictment that named 8 individuals. Dominic was not among those charged in that matter, which was either good fortune or a result of his relatively peripheral role. I do not know which, and I do not particularly need to know. He moved out of my parents' house in March and into a rental on the east side of the city. My parents did not cover the first month's rent. That was new. I want to tell you what I have come to understand about the years that preceded that Tuesday evening at 9:47 when a geolocation alert buzzed once against my desk. For a long time I operated under the assumption that keeping my professional life separate from my family was a form of protection. Protection for them from something they might find hard to understand. Protection for me from the particular vulnerability of being seen fully by people who have not always handled what they know about you with care. What I understand now is that the separation also made it possible for everyone, including me, to exist inside a version of the family that was comfortable and incomplete and quietly unsustainable. My parents could hold Dominic in the role of the one who needed help because they could not see me clearly enough to know that I was the one in the room with the most capacity to reorder things. And I could hold myself in the role of the one who absorbed it quietly because I had, for years, made the quiet absorbing feel like a choice when it had actually become a habit. What Dominic did, taking that key off the hook, driving that vehicle to Skidaway Road, handing it over for $5,200 with the smirk I later heard he wore the entire drive there, was not the act of a man who had never been taught better. It was the act of a man who had been taught, very consistently, by the results of his own behavior over many years, that the consequences for people like him were negotiable. That family absorbed them. That Claire absorbed them. That there was always a ceiling just above his head, even when he jumped. I was the ceiling. I had been the ceiling for years, and I had not fully known it, and neither had he. I built nothing in secret, not in the way that is sometimes meant. I did not scheme. I did not plan. I did not engineer his downfall in a late-night session with a legal pad and a cold cup of coffee. I reported a federal vehicle stolen because it was a federal vehicle, and it had been stolen. The law moved the way the law moves. I simply did not intervene. I simply did not place myself, one more time, between Dominic and the thing that was coming toward him. That is not the same as revenge. It is much quieter than revenge, and it costs considerably more, and it changes things in ways that revenge does not. My father called me on a Saturday morning in the first week of April. He was at the golf club and he was, I think, sitting outside because I could hear the particular sound of outdoor air and distant conversation in the background. He said, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you, Claire. I don't think I've said that enough. I don't think I've understood enough for a long time what there was to be proud of." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "I'm sorry about the car thing, about what your mother said, about a lot of things." I said, "I know." He said, "Are we okay?" I said, "We're working on it." He said, "That's fair." I said, "It is." We talked for another few minutes about ordinary things, the way people do when they are finding their way back to the surface from somewhere deep. And then we said goodbye, and I sat for a while in my apartment on East Jones Street with the morning light coming in through the window and my cold coffee on the table beside me and thought about what it means to finally stop performing the role that a family has assigned you and simply stand in the space where you actually are. The loudest comebacks are built in silence. I believe that now, not as a motto, but as something I have lived and can account for, year by year, choice by choice, unreturned phone call by unreturned phone call, hour by hour of work done carefully and without witness in a federal building on Bull Street in a city that does not always know what it has inside its quieter people. The power was never in the confrontation. The power was in the years I spent building something real, while everyone at the table assumed they already knew who I was. I want to say one more thing to anyone watching this who recognizes something of themselves in this story. Not in the specific details, not in the federal vehicle or the GPS or the arrest on Christmas Day, but in the feeling underneath all of it. The feeling of being the one in your family who is expected to hold the ceiling up while everyone below it moves freely, who is called rigid for having standards and selfish for having limits, who is told that being family means absorbing whatever comes your way with a smile and a phone call returned and a plate passed across the table as though nothing is happening. If that is you, I want you to hear this. The limits you set are not selfishness. The standards you hold are not rigidity. And the moment you stop being the ceiling is not a betrayal. It is, in fact, the most honest thing you may have ever done for every person in that room, including the ones who will not understand it for a very long time. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been the one your family counted on to absorb the consequences of someone else's choices? And if you finally stopped, what happened next? I would truly love to know. To the 46 people in my family's living room on Habersham Street, and to the one person across from me in that armchair who finally understood what he had been looking at all along, I wish you the specific grace of a long, quiet reckoning, the kind that changes things. And to you watching this, on whatever evening you found this story and pressed play, thank you for staying until the end. I want to close this with something just for you, and I mean this from the entire team behind this channel. What we do here is not simple, and it is not small. Every week, we sit with stories like this one, stories of women who were told to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating, more patient, more invisible. And we do the work of making sure those stories are heard with the attention and the craft and the dignity they deserve. This channel exists because we believe that the quietest women are often the ones who have done the most extraordinary things, and that their stories deserve to be told exactly as they are, without noise, without gloating, without anything other than the truth told clearly. If you found something in this story that stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment. Come back next week. We will be here, building in silence, the same as always. With so much respect and gratitude from all of us at Executive Revenge Stories.